Hello and welcome to Breaking Embargo. I'm Peter Barnes. That's James Hanson. Let's get into it. James, thank you so much for joining us here at Breaking Embargo. It's an absolute pleasure to have you. We've worked together on and off, on those ridiculously early mornings over at Times Radio Breakfast. I mean, I agreed to come into the studio and then I suddenly think at about 2 a.m. thinking, why am I doing this?
You were like the only one who would valiantly schlep in to London Bridge in the early hours of the morning when even the night tubes aren't properly running and the buses are a bit rubbish. And yet you would come in. So fair play. It's a bit weird, though, because normally it's me sort of asking the questions of you, and now it's role reversal. So
honestly,
it's a bit strange.
It's been ridiculous. I've had so many people on who I've worked with in that way, and they've all said it's like watching a dog meow. It's like, it's not wrong, but it's just a bit weird.
I get it.
Yeah, obviously you're now over at LBC. You've got a great show over there. I've listened to it a couple of times. Congratulations on that to begin with. But obviously you've been around in the political scene and the media for quite some time. I mean, does this feel unprecedented to you? Like everything we're going through just feels like I would like to live through like one event that isn't world changing just for like 15 minutes.
It's really interesting because almost ever since the Brexit referendum, ever since 2016, so the best part of a decade now, people have been waiting for things to, in inverted commas, get back to normal. People thought it might happen once the Brexit issue was resolved, once we left. Then it was, well, let's get the pandemic out of the way. Then it was, okay, when the Tory psychodrama's over, things will return to normal. There has to come a point when you have to ask yourself, maybe this is the new normal. Maybe we're not going back to what it used to be like, where we'd have, quite technocratic policy debates over, what should we be doing with this area of public spending? We're into far bigger, meatier, more existential political questions now. And it's hard to see that changing, to be honest. I know there's been a lot of debate as to whether we're now in the era of five-party politics as opposed to two-party politics. What is the future of the Conservative Party? What is the future of the Labour Party? These are big questions. I suppose the only upside is, even though really in my heart of hearts I quite liked it 10 years ago where things felt a bit more normal, the only good thing is for the likes of you and me, Peter, it ain't half interesting.
That's true. I mean, my inner political nerd has never been more satisfied than it has been in the last 5 or 10 years, that's for certain. But the interesting thing is, I can't help but notice the rise of, we call it the culture wars, but I think to broaden it out, the rise of cultural politics is something that we're not really used to in this country. We've had, like you said, very technocratic, very detail-heavy policy arguments and debates, but now we're talking about more broader themes, like the direction of the country, the vision of what we want our country to look like. And I think a lot of people in the political world have been rather caught out on that. And, I think that is the reason that, everything does seem a bit unprecedented. Things are all over the place. It's because the people that we've often looked to for the answers are saying, I don't even understand the question.
Yeah, I mean, faith in government is probably at its lowest level ever. And I'm always slightly wary of doing the kind of things have never been so bad shtick because, faith in politicians has always been low. You could go back 30 or 40 years and people would say they're all liars, they're all a bunch of crooks. That is often the default setting. But it does feel like people's faith in the government's ability to affect any change is very different. And, culture and politics are increasingly overlapping. The fact that we have a reality TV star essentially running the free world says a lot. And what I worry about a bit is that, Britain historically has always, I think, been quite unified when it comes to culture. We would watch the same TV programs, we would listen to the same radio programs, we would read many of the same newspapers. And even though there would be some areas of division, we had a sort of shared cultural experience. And because we live in the age of digital media and where people can go down social media rabbit holes and, go into echo chambers, I think our cultural experience is becoming far more fragmented now. So, just what people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis becomes very different. And as a result, people's political views become very different. And I'm not sure how we bridge that.
No, I made the same argument that, people often look to me like, how do we make this better? Like, what do we do to fix it? And I'm like, honestly, I don't have the answer to it. And I think it is a matter of we've got to get through it. And I think how we get through it will be literally the answer to that question, because this kind of idea of being able to predict things and plan things and strategize out I think it's gone out the window because the old rules don't apply anymore. The old rules
Yeah.
of our politics are just gone. They're gone now. You know, we talk about five-party politics. I actually think we're actually down to kind of two-party politics, but not in the like political party sense, but in the way of it's either the kind of the Brexity kind of nation state way, or it is the globalist internationalist way. I think that's the new divide in our politics. I don't think it's
Yes.
party political. I think it is that. It is, do you think Britain could do it on its own and Britain can, you know, that idea? Or do you think the future is the things like the EU, things like the United Nations, the international organizations? I think that divide is not only splitting the country, it's tearing political parties
Splitting
apart.
the world. This is
Yeah.
it. You see it all over the world, and it's a bigger theme. I mean, it's funny because, you know, I feel like I've slipped through the cracks, really, of this emerging political divide because I would consider myself to be someone who is sort of economically and socially liberal in the classic sense of the word, you know, centre right when it comes to economics, but also relatively progressive when it comes to social issues. And frankly, we've had this scenario. It seems to me that the world is moving right on culture and left on economics. And I'm like, no, I don't want either of those.
Yeah,
You know
I
what
know
I
what
mean?
you're saying.
I'm not comfortable with either of those. You know, I take that unfashionable view of no, can we go a little bit more centre on culture and can we go a little bit right on economics?
Yeah.
So I feel like I've sort of lost out. Really, I'm very outdated. I'm very 2011 basically.
Yeah, very 2011. But it's interesting you bring that up because really, the number of people I hear that they say I'm politically homeless. Now I hear that phrase all the time. Like the number of people that said, "Oh, I didn't leave this party left me." On that sense of, there is nothing for anybody to grip onto anymore. I think
Yeah.
is a pretty dangerous place for our politics to be in some ways because I think bad actors can usurp in on that, and we do see it around the world, and I think my fear is it could happen here in Britain. I don't think we're there yet, but I think it's getting there on the left and on the right. That people can exploit this sense of unease, exploit this sense of nothing really having a firm grip because you know we've seen what happens when sectarian politics comes to town, when ideological, heavy ideological politics comes to town. You know, I don't think we're quite ready to have a lot of those fights. You know,
No.
from the centre or the liberal perspective, and that concerns me quite a lot.
I agree, and I think, frankly, centre parties, not that I really would consider either the Conservatives or Labour as centre parties, but mainstream parties, perhaps is a
Mainstream,
better way of
yes,
putting it, have for too long ignored uncomfortable conversations. I mean, most notably over immigration. You know, frankly, the political class, but particularly the last 14 years of Conservative government, spectacularly failed on immigration in a way that cannot do anything other than undermine public trust in politicians. If you started your period in office talking about getting immigration down to the tens of thousands, and by the end net migration was almost 1 million people a year, I mean, that's not just failure, that is catastrophic failure. And whatever you think about immigration, if you're going to promise one thing, you have to at least get close to delivering it at some point. And I think part of the reason that, you know, immigration maybe hasn't been addressed fully is because no one is prepared to have an honest conversation. The proponents of it are not prepared to actually defend the numbers that we have. If you think we can accommodate 1 million people a year, say it. Come out and make that argument. But they won't. They'll kind of be mealy-mouthed and say, yeah, but, you know, we need people working in the NHS and the care service. Yes, of course, but you're saying 1 million a year. And on the flip side, it's allowed populists to kind of ramp up. What I do worry about is being increasingly anti-immigrant rhetoric and making immigrants, as opposed to the level of immigration, the scapegoats. But they're feeding into legitimate public anger. And this is where there's an opportunity for Farage. I think there's an opportunity for someone from the populist left that we haven't seen. I mean, obviously we saw Corbyn. I think if there was a shrewder figure, that is something we should watch for. I mean, I would not welcome it in any way, shape or form. But I think there is some space there because in the same way that, you know, when's the best time to start a business? A recession, counterintuitively. Look at all the amazing blue chip companies that have been founded in a recession. The same way to kind of start a new political project, the best time is when the mainstream political parties have gone bust.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I really couldn't. And it's interesting you bring up the kind of the populist phrase because often the people use that word in a kind of in a way to in a derogatory way, I think. But I
Yeah, it
think
doesn't have to be.
it doesn't have to be. And I think this is what so many people have got wrong when they're trying to combat, against these, what they see as a threat of populism is, well, get a better argument. If you're
Yeah.
not winning, if you're not convincing people with your argument, it's not the other person's fault that they're winning. It's your fault
No.
you're not winning. Get in the game. And it is infuriating to see so many people in the mainstream, in the media as well, continually kind of decry people for saying, oh, it's just a populist, it's just this, or they're just that. No, no, no. Get better at arguing your positions, because the
Yes.
public are wanting answers now, and they're not, and they're demanding better. And unfortunately, the biggest problem I have is they're not turning out to vote against something. They're just not turning out. For me, the biggest threat we face as a nation is a disengaged electorate. And I think
Well, we're not giving people a reason to vote for anything
Yeah.
as well, which I do worry about. I
Yeah.
think every vote really, to go back to that point about the last 10 years, what you can trace really ever since Brexit is that every single major election we've had has been a protest vote, the result of it. Brexit, you can say, was a protest vote against the status quo. The fact that Theresa May was denied her majority in 2017 was a protest vote. Boris's majority in 2019 was a protest vote against the failure of Parliament to enact the results of the referendum and the gridlock in the Commons. And then you can say the result of the last election was a protest vote against 14 years of Conservative rule. And then most recently, those local elections, with Reform doing so well, was a protest vote against the Labour government and the Conservatives as well, the mainstream parties. And you do wonder how long that can continue. At what point do people need to start voting for something again? Because let's say Reform, and I don't want this to happen, let's say Reform get in at the next election. Well, how long until people are dissatisfied with them, and then they're just going to have a protest vote against them? We need to start offering people a prospectus for where we are heading as a country. And I think both Starmer and Badenoch in particular, they have no message as to where they're taking the country.
I couldn't agree more. The lack of vision to give to people from all political parties, I think, is just non-existent. My thing with Reform has always been they're a band of happy warriors against something. The problem I think Reform are going to have is if they do get into power, what are they going to do? Because they can't agree on how to fix the problem. They're very good at identifying a problem. They're not very good at coming up with solutions to fix the thing.
No, they're not. And I think this is something that actually, those of us in the media have a far greater responsibility to hold people to account in Reform when they come on the media, to actually grill them about their policies. If Nigel Farage is writing newspaper articles going, this is what I'm going to do when I'm in number 10, well, let's grill him on it. How are you funding this? Are you putting the national debt up further? If that's the case, well, then long term, we're going to be in an even worse economic situation. How are you funding these policies? Nigel Farage, for example, is saying, I know there's been this whole thing about, what is Farage's plan for the NHS? Does he want to privatise the NHS, etc.? Well, I think it's perfectly legitimate to say he's coming from a political situation. You must excuse me, by the way. I've got my friend's cat in the background who's currently digging up the litter box, if you can hear that in the background. Nigel Farage has, in the past, made a big thing about, the NHS as it's currently funded is not sustainable, etc., etc. It's perfectly legitimate to ask, well, then what is your policy for the NHS? And even though they deny now that they want to privatise the NHS, Nigel Farage has very recently said he doesn't think the way the NHS is funded currently is sustainable. Okay, then what?
Yes.
You can't just take pretty much the biggest area of public spending and say, oh, yeah, it's not sustainable, but not offer a solution. If you're seriously saying that you want to be Prime Minister, but you can't explain how the National Health Service is going to be funded under your administration, that is a failure. So we do need to hold, politicians, but particularly Reform, to account. They are very, very good communicators. Farage in particular, he's the most gifted political communicator of his generation. But we do need to hold him to account.
Yeah, I would say the same thing right across the board, because one of my big annoyances in the last general election was I don't feel that Labour were put under that much scrutiny by the mainstream. Not really. I think when we're starting to see this rather lack of a plan play out in front of us right across the policy spectrum, not just on immigration, but, on pretty much everything. They got into power and they went, now what? That's my big problem. But I do think the electorate also has a responsibility in this to start saying, well, we're demanding answers. We've got to start saying, well, how are you going to do this? But rather than what are you going to do? That question really does need to switch on its head for a lot of people.
Totally. And I also think Labour have a particular problem. And I think it actually goes to Keir Starmer as a man, which is, I think he's got a track record of frankly breaking promises. or of lying, if you want to put it that way. And you could say every politician has this. I think Starmer has a particular issue because he's elected Labour leader on a very left-wing, soft Corbynite manifesto, and he broke most of those, pretty much all of his 10 pledges that he made during the leadership campaign. A lot of the stuff that has now been imposed since the election victory was not in the Labour manifesto. The winter fuel payments was not in the Labour manifesto. And I think the public do feel, well, hang on a minute, do you just lie to us at every single turn? It doesn't mean that you can't do controversial things. When the Conservative and coalition government, the Conservative Lib Dem coalition imposed austerity, you can't say they hadn't campaigned on that. It was literally what the Conservatives campaigned on in 2010. It was unpopular, but they had a mandate to do it. And increasingly people feel like we're returning to austerity, although I think that's a joke, to be honest.
Yeah, that's just not true.
How can you have the state accounting for 45% of the UK economy, record levels pretty much, and call that austerity? It's a joke.
I know. It doesn't.
And the people whose answer is that we should have more state spending, my mind is blown.
Yeah. There's a wall that you can't see here. There's got a big red mark on it where I just keep banging my head against it every time.
Yes. Because people go on about, we have underfunded public services and all this kind of stuff. I would dispute that heavily, given we spend £300 billion a year on welfare. But these people who say, oh, we should be spending even more, even a greater percentage of our GDP on public services. You think to yourself, well, hang on a minute. So we now spend 45% of the entire economy goes towards public spending. Are we getting more for that? Are there more police on the streets? Is your hospital better run? Can you get a GP appointment more easily? Is your kid's school better? No, I don't think it's noticeably better than when the UK economy was, 35% state spending. I don't notice any material difference. It's almost as if state spending isn't the answer.
Yeah. If anything, the last 2 to 3 years have proven the fact that it isn't lack of money that is the problem. I think, if anything, we're living through proof of that right now. And, I think a lot of people are going to become, like we said, become a little unstuck when it comes to answers on, well, wait a minute, you said they just needed more money. That's evidently not true. And I'll go back to a big point that in this country, when it comes to our public sector, is nobody gets fired. They have these huge budgets, they have these huge responsibilities, standards decline, services decline, and yet nobody is held accountable for that.
The lack of accountability in the public sector, I think, is a real issue, and it does need to be addressed. And yeah, I wonder how we get out of this, because as I mentioned, I'm out of step with where most voters are, because actually I think that the political mood music is that we need to move move left on the economy. You look at, actually, Farage has been very clever for someone who is really a kind of unreconstructed Thatcherite when it comes to economics in his heart. He was the first person, getting his photo taken, calling for the nationalisation of British steel.
I said the same thing. I said the exact same thing. Yeah,
he's clever because he knows. Yeah. I mean, that's the Trump playbook. Trump, who is adding trillions more to the US national debt, which is already astronomical, and the debt is. We are going to have the problem is, Brexit got in the way of the conversation we were having as a country about our national debt. For many years, the whole narrative about austerity and deficits dominated, and it's as if people forgot that is an issue. And as I continually point out to friends of mine when this issue comes up, I say, you do realise what austerity was, what reducing the deficit was, that the deficit wasn't the debt. The deficit was just the rate at which the debt was increasing. And all Cameron and Osborne were saying is, should we just not add to it? Just not add any more? Should we just try and get the budget into balance? They weren't even talking about running a surplus. They were just saying, let's just get it into balance. We don't add any more. We spend £100 billion a year on debt interest alone, not even paying down the debt, just debt interest. Yeah. And there are seriously people who go, I think Rachel Reeves should loosen her borrowing rules and borrow a bit more. Seriously? Because every pound we spend on debt interest is a pound that we can't spend on police, hospitals, schools, etc.
Yeah, the lack of fiscal discipline by successive governments is ridiculous. But then again, I blame the electorate for not understanding that they can't just have their cake and eat it too. But then politicians have to be brave enough to say that. And I think that's a big problem. We have a political class that is terrified of being honest with the public in all fronts, not just in terms of, what they want to do, but in terms of saying, we can't do this because of this. And I
The
think that
triple
is a big
lock, case in
problem.
point, we cannot afford the triple lock. I'm
No,
sorry, we
we
just
can't.
can't. We
Yeah.
just can't.
Don't get me wrong. Like, the winter fuel allowance is the prime example of this as well. It's not a very large amount of money, but the principle of it is the problem. Is that
Yeah.
and I use the same argument with free school meals as well. Lovely principle, but at the end of the day, where do we draw the line here? Because you're giving money away that we can't afford to give away.
Controversially, just to be kind of contrarian, free school meals is one of those areas where I would give every state school kid a free school meal.
The number of people,
Costs
the number of people I hear on that side of the argument is interesting.
costs a lot of money,
Yeah.
and look, I went to a private school. I was very lucky. I never had to worry about where my next meal was coming from. But it staggers me that there is this inequality within the state sector, that you've got kids on free school meals and others who are not. And I just think, let's just remove the stigma from, oh, you're on free school meals and all that kind of stuff. Frankly, no one's saying you've got to pay for the chair you sit on. You've got to pay for the whiteboard the teacher's drawing on. I think we can fund free school meals for everyone, I would argue. But
Yeah.
no, winter fuel payment, all of that. I mean, the winter fuel payment, actually, the principle, I agree with what Labour did, as controversial as it was. Yes, of course, wealthier pensioners should not be receiving the winter fuel payment. It was an electoral bribe, basically, when it was introduced by Gordon Brown.
Yeah.
I don't think they should have done it, though. I think it was stupid politics. I think they should have realised that for the amount of money they're saving, which is a pittance in the grand scheme of things, this total state pension bill is over £150 billion a year. They reckon they're saving £1.5 billion a year. It's actually less than that when you take into account the number of pensioners who've now signed on to pension credit. For the political fuss it caused, you may as well just change the triple lock, and then you would save far more and do far more to bring down the pensions bill for the same political fuss.
Oh, the impending pensions crisis in this country is terrifying. I'm already stocking up on tinned goods because we've got all this sort of new people running into the public sector. We're not talking about public sector pensions to begin with. We have this impending kind of dark shadow over us economically, and it is the pensions crisis. And the triple lock is like the first thing that we can do to really get a grip to this, because yes, it might look bad, but it is necessary. And like you said, a lot of this stuff was electoral bribes. They were bribes, and that's got to stop.
Excuse me. And you look at Denmark now, they're putting up their state pension age to 70, which is a bit of a landmark, because they very sensibly, in my view, passed a law a while back to peg the state pension age to average life expectancy, which to me seems common sense.
Yeah, I don't understand why that's we're living longer. We're living
Why
longer.
could you be against that? When the state pension was first introduced, average life expectancy was below the state pension age. It wasn't until just after the Second World War that average life expectancy actually exceeded the state pension age. So it didn't really cost the government much money at all, because most people just wouldn't live long enough to claim it. Now we have a situation where many people, and this is clearly a good thing, are living, into their 80s and 90s and beyond. So some people are claiming their state pension for 30 plus years. It's not affordable.
It's not affordable. And the chance of retiring early and all this stuff, like, we not only have the pensions problems, we have an impending skills gap problem, because we're losing people out of the workforce earlier and earlier, and we're not training people to fill that gap. What we're relying on is cheap foreign labor, which is then fueling the immigration crisis, which is then fueling the lack of joined up thinking on so much of politics in this country will be our downfall. It really will be.
But here's the thing, Peter. So let's say you and me start a political party, and we're called the Take Money Off Pensioners Party. We're not getting any votes. We're not getting, even the young people, one or two young people might vote for us on kind of Yimby Twitter. But by and large, no one's going to vote for us. This is the issue. And so if you're Kemi Badenoch, who I think could, I think it would be sensible for someone on the centre right, like you and me are, to kind of have that argument about, well, is the state pensions bill affordable? How can we reform it, etc., etc. But it would be electoral suicide for Kemi Badenoch to seriously entertain that conversation. So how does anything get fixed when there's this kind of electoral disincentive from having these grown-up... Now, on certain things, like the need to run a surplus, which I'd vote in a heartbeat for any party that said we're going to run a surplus. I think with stuff like that, I think the public are more persuadable. I think occasionally the public are open to a bit like what Cameron and Osborne had to do prior to 2010. Some people say it cost them the majority, maybe it did, but they got into power, and long run, it helped them win the majority in 2015 because people thought, well, you are moving the country in the right direction. You're starting to take action. The economy is improving, etc. I think people are open to being told the truth and leveled with. I think a lot of voters quite like being treated like the adults they are.
Yes.
And I do
Yes.
think the British people have an innate common sense and can see when something is unsustainable.
Yeah,
But yeah,
I agree.
if you start going after the pensions, yeah, good luck. I mean,
That's true.
I've
But
done
I
many a
think the
phone
big
in
problem,
recent weeks on LBC about it, and they don't like it when I say I'm going to take the pensions off them.
making friends everywhere you go, James, aren't you?
Exactly.
But no, I just gonna say, just really as a final point, I think that's a great idea. But the problem is nobody trusts anybody. That's the problem. We
Yeah.
can't have an honest conversation if you don't trust the person who is having that conversation with you, that they're telling the truth. Until we bridge that gap and we fix the issue of trust in our politics, we can't fix any of the big issues because it all comes down to the fact of you're just lying to me. You're doing this because you're funded by that person, or you're doing that because you believe in this. Like, the number of people on the right that still go, oh, I don't like them because they voted for Remain. And that was 2016. It's 2025.
Yeah, and also, newsflash, a lot of people on the right voted for Remain. I
Yeah.
voted for... I mean, I was a reluctant Remainer. I used to consider myself a Eurosceptic, back when being a Eurosceptic meant, oh, you know, I don't want any further European
Yes,
expansion,
yeah,
but
yeah.
I don't want to get out of the club because on balance, and I was no great lover of the EU. But my kind of calculation was that A, it would damage the economy, which it factually has. Now, that's not to say that that means Brexit was wrong. Most of the valid arguments against staying in the EU were non-economic. They're about sovereignty and control of our borders, etc. Although obviously immigration has gone up since we've left. But also because I could just see that we would have years of political chaos, which we did have. The churn of prime ministers, the slow death of the Conservative Party. I think that was always my big fear, and it has come to pass. But it doesn't mean, since when did you have to be a Brexiteer to be on the right?
Yeah.
Why should you have to think
I
that?
call them ideological litmus tests.
Yeah.
That the left and the right now require you to have for you to be part of the club. I've always said the Conservative Party's great advantage was the broad church. It was that you were fellow travelers in the same direction. Now we've gone down this kind of Corbynista. You've got to believe in this. You've got to believe in that. You've got to believe in this. And that has just torn us all apart. And I think that it's not just the Tory party that's faced it. I think the right in general has this problem of,
Yes.
you've got to believe in certain things to be classed as a real conservative, a nonsense phrase to anybody who's ever studied this stuff, which is just a little bit. But honestly, James, we could talk about this stuff till we're blue in the face, ironically. But thank you so much for joining us. Great to see you doing so well over at LBC. Hopefully see you soon. And thanks again for joining us.
Absolutely.